imagine being stuck in a place,
Hmm.
right? You can't leave, and someone else controls everything. Even basic things like food and water.
Yeah.
That's what life's like for people in Gaza.
Yeah.
And to really understand their situation, we have to understand Hamas.
You're right. It's easy to just focus on the headlines, but Hamas is, well, they're tied to the lives of real people caught in a really complex situation.
Absolutely. So we're going to go deeper than the headlines, peel back the layers and explore the history of Hamas. They're often, well, demonized, but not really understood.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story with twists and turns, and to get Hamas, we have to go back, way back to the beginning of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
That's so true. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces.
Right.
So before we jump into Hamas, can you give us that overview, the big events that led to their formation?
Absolutely. We can't talk about Hamas without the whole historical context. So think back to 1948 when Israel was established. Now, Israelis see this as, independence, but for Palestinians, it's the Nakba, meaning catastrophe. Hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced, became refugees.
Right. It's the same event, but experienced in such different ways.
Exactly. And this displacement, the loss, the injustice, well, it fueled Palestinian resistance movements. Groups like the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, and Fatah, they emerged fighting for a Palestinian state.
So from this displacement, this resistance, Hamas emerges. And the first Intifada in 1987, that feels like a key moment for them. Can you explain what it was and why it was so important?
So the first Intifada was an uprising against Israeli occupation. And it wasn't just armed resistance, it was everyday people, protests, strikes, even refusing to pay taxes just to challenge the occupation.
Wow.
Yeah, a powerful display of Palestinian frustration, their desire for self-determination.
And this is where Sheikh Ahmed Yassin and the beginnings of Hamas come in.
Yeah, Yassin, he was, well, a complex figure, a quadriplegic man deeply involved with the Muslim Brotherhood, known for its social work, but also its ideology of Islam and Palestinian liberation. He started Hamas in '87 during the Intifada as an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood.
So Hamas starts with social services. Were they always a militant group, or did that come later?
Initially, they were really focused on services like education and healthcare, especially in Gaza. It helped them gain popularity, trust among Palestinians. But from the start, they had this clear political vision rooted in Islam and the creation of a Palestinian state in all of historical Palestine.
That's interesting. They were building support through social work while at the same time pushing their political ideology. And then things changed dramatically in '92 with the deportation of hundreds of Hamas members to Lebanon.
Yeah, this deportation, it was, well, meant to weaken Hamas. Israel saw them as a threat and figured exiling their leaders would cripple them. But it backfired.
Unintended consequences. So what happened because of the deportation?
Well, it did the opposite. Being exiled to Lebanon gave Hamas a new platform, raised their profile internationally, and connected them with other groups resisting Israel, like most notably Hezbollah.
Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shiite militia. That's a big connection.
It is. It had a big impact on Hamas's tactics and ideology. They started using more militant strategies, including suicide bombings, something that hadn't been seen before in Palestinian resistance.
That shift to suicide bombings was a turning point, raised really difficult ethical questions about the methods and goals of resistance.
You're right. It was controversial, drew a lot of international condemnation, but it also showed Hamas was willing to use violence to achieve its goals. The deportation changed them. They came back with, well, stronger resolve and new tactics.
And then in the mid-'90s, we have the Oslo Accords, this agreement that was supposed to be the roadmap to peace. What impact did the Oslo Accords have on Hamas?
The Oslo Accords were, well, they were complex and flawed. While they were praised internationally, many on both sides were suspicious.
It seems like both sides had reasons to be wary. It didn't really address the core issues, did it?
No, not really. Oslo focused mostly on transferring administrative control, basically giving Palestinians responsibility for their own governance in parts of the West Bank and Gaza.
Right.
But the bigger issues, like Israeli settlements, the right of return for Palestinian refugees, the future of Jerusalem, those were left unresolved.
So it was more about managing the conflict, not solving it.
Yes.
And that's key, isn't it? Because those unresolved issues, they just festered, leading to more violence, more disillusionment.
Exactly. Oslo, despite its good intentions, it failed to deliver peace. And for Hamas, the accords were, well, a betrayal of Palestinian hopes. They saw the Palestinian Authority, which was created by Oslo as collaborating with Israel, not truly representing the Palestinian people.
And then in 1994, a horrific event happens that deepens the divide and hardens everyone's stance, the Hebron massacre.
Yeah, the Hebron massacre was a terrible turning point. A Jewish settler opened fire on Palestinians praying in a mosque, killing 29, wounding dozens more. It sent shockwaves through the region, just inflamed tensions.
It's hard to imagine the impact this had on Hamas.
It was huge. It fueled their narrative of Israeli aggression, reinforced their belief that violence was the only language Israel understood. In response, Hamas carried out a series of suicide bombings and other attacks on Israeli civilians, escalating the cycle of violence.
So Oslo, which was meant to bring peace, ends up creating more tension, more violence, and then Hebron just pours gasoline on the fire, pushing Hamas toward more extreme tactics.
Yes. And from this point, Hamas's path changes. They start to participate more in Palestinian politics, leading to, well, a surprising victory in the 2006 Palestinian elections.
That election was a game changer. But before we get into that, I think we need to pause here. Let all this sink in.
You're right. It's a lot to take in. But understanding this history, it's essential for grasping Hamas and their role in this ongoing conflict.
We'll pick up the story in the next part of our deep dive into Hamas. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss it.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the Oslo Accords and the Hebron massacre and how they impacted Hamas.
Right, and it's wild how, events that were supposed to bring peace end up fueling more violence,
Yeah.
and how that really kind of cemented Hamas's position. It just shows you how complex this conflict is.
Yeah, it does. And then Hamas decides to participate in the 2006 Palestinian elections. Kind of a surprise, right?
What made them do that?
Well, it was strategic. By then, Hamas was pretty popular, especially in Gaza,
Yeah.
because of their social services and their strong stance against Israel. They saw the elections as a way to gain some legitimacy, maybe even, influence the Palestinian Authority.
And it worked, didn't it? I mean, they won a majority in the Palestinian parliament. That shocked a lot of people.
Yeah, it really did. It sent shockwaves, through the region and beyond. Israel, the U.S., Europe, a lot of countries refused to recognize the Hamas-led government, called them a terrorist organization, because they wouldn't renounce violence or recognize Israel's right to exist.
It's kind of contradictory, isn't it? The U.S., always talking about democracy, but then not acknowledging the results of a democratic election.
Yeah, it shows you the complexities of international politics and the double standards that are often applied. And this refusal to recognize the Hamas government, well, it had big consequences. It led to a cutoff of international aid, further isolating Hamas.
And that isolation, plus the tensions they already had with Fatah, the other main Palestinian faction,
Yeah.
that led to civil war in Gaza, right?
Yeah, exactly. The situation just went downhill fast, and it all culminated in Hamas taking control of Gaza in 2007. And that effectively split the Palestinian territories, into two entities. You have Hamas-controlled Gaza, and then Fatah-controlled West Bank.
So now you've got this divided Palestinian territory, each controlled by a different faction. And how did Israel respond to Hamas taking over Gaza?
Blockade.
A blockade.
A blockade that's still in place today. Israel said it was necessary, to stop Hamas from smuggling weapons and launching attacks. But the impact on the people in Gaza has been, well, devastating. It's really restricted the flow of goods and people in and out.
It sounds like collective punishment.
A lot of international organizations, human rights groups, they've condemned the blockade, saying it's a form of collective punishment. They argue that it violates international law and just makes the humanitarian crisis in Gaza even worse.
And this blockade is the backdrop for the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas.
It is. The blockade is a major point of tension, and Hamas often uses it to justify their continued armed resistance. And it's created this cycle of violence, of retribution, both sides blaming the other for the suffering.
We hear a lot about rocket attacks from Gaza into Israel. What's Hamas's strategy with those?
Well, those rocket attacks, they're a way to try to break the blockade, to pressure Israel. Hamas says they have a right to resist the occupation, that the rockets are self-defense.
Those rockets often target Israeli civilians, don't they?
They do, and that kind of indiscriminate targeting of civilians, well, it's illegal under international law, and it's been widely condemned. It's definitely fueled the perception of Hamas as as a terrorist organization.
So we have this cycle of violence fueled by the blockade. Hamas launches rockets. Israel responds with military operations in Gaza.
Mm.
Just a tragic situation, and there are no easy answers.
No, there aren't. And the humanitarian cost, it's staggering. The people of Gaza, they've been through years of conflict, of economic hardship. They lack basic necessities. The blockade has created a really dire situation, limited access to health care, to clean water, basic services.
It's hard to imagine what it must be like to live in those conditions.
It is. And it's important to remember that, beyond the headlines, beyond the politics, there are real people there, families just trying to survive in a very challenging, very dangerous environment.
It's a reminder that peace isn't just about agreements on paper. It's about the lives of ordinary people. But finding a path to peace in this situation, it just seems so difficult.
It is. But it's not impossible. To understand how we might move forward, we need to look closer at Hamas's ideology, their goals, and their relationships with other players in the region.
That sounds like a good place to pick up in the final part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
We've been looking at the history of Hamas, from their beginnings in the Muslim Brotherhood
Right.
to taking control in Gaza. It's a complicated story.
It is, and to really get where they are now, we have to look at their relationship with other big players in the region, especially Iran.
Iran, right, a powerful country and definitely a critic of Israel. So how's their relationship with Hamas changed over time?
Well, Iran has been backing Hamas for a long time, giving them money, military training, weapons. They see Hamas as a useful ally in their own fight against Israel and Western influence in the Middle East.
So it's like a strategic alliance
Yeah.
based on shared interests, a common enemy.
Yeah, pretty much. But it's also been up and down, depending on the political situation, the shifting dynamics in the region. Sometimes they're close, sometimes there's distance, even tension.
It's a bit of a dance then. What are some of the things that have affected that dynamic?
Well, one big one was the Syrian civil war.
Mhm.
Iran's support for the Syrian regime, well, it put them on the opposite side of some in Hamas who were sympathetic to the Syrian rebels, caused some friction. Things cooled off for a bit.
But they've kind of made up since then, haven't they?
Yeah, in recent years, they've gotten closer again. Worries about Israel, and feeling like they need to present a united front against the West.
So Iran is key in helping Hamas with their military.
Yeah.
But what about like Hamas internally? How do they actually govern Gaza?
Ah, that's another layer of complexity. They see themselves as a resistance movement, but they also have to run a territory with over 2 million people, providing services, keeping order, trying to keep the economy going, and all under that blockade.
That's got to be a tough balancing act. Are they good at governing?
It's mixed. I mean, they've managed to keep things relatively stable in Gaza, provide those basic services despite everything. But they've also been accused of human rights abuses, cracking down on people who disagree with them, putting their military first instead of the people's needs.
That's the dilemma, isn't it? Security versus the well-being of the people. It doesn't seem like there's any easy way out of this.
There really isn't. And that's what makes finding peace so hard. Both sides feel trapped, caught in this cycle of violence, hitting back and forth.
So where do we go from here? Is there any hope for lasting peace between Israel and Hamas?
It's tough to be optimistic. The obstacles are huge. Hamas won't recognize Israel. Israel sees Hamas as an existential threat. There's just no trust. Years of conflict, of bloodshed,
It's hard to imagine them bridging that gap.
It is. But history shows us that even the toughest conflicts, they can be solved through dialogue, compromise, and being willing to see the other side as human.
That's asking a lot in this case. What would it take to actually break this cycle of violence to move towards a more peaceful future?
I think it would take a fundamental change in how both sides think. Hamas would have to give up violence and recognize Israel's right to exist. Israel would have to end the blockade and really engage in negotiations that address the Palestinian grievances. Jerusalem, the right of return for refugees, those things.
Those are huge things to ask. It's hard to imagine either side agreeing to that.
It is. But without some willingness to find common ground, the conflict's just going to keep going and more people will suffer.
So the future's, well, it's uncertain, but understanding the history, the motivations, the complexities, it's It's a start.
I agree. We can't just rely on sound bites and headlines. We have to dig deeper, talk about it in an informed way, and question our own assumptions. That's the only way we can even start to imagine a different path, a path to a more peaceful, a more just future for both Palestinians and Israelis.
That's a powerful message to end on. It reminds us that even when things seem impossible, we can't lose hope for a better future. Thank you for taking us through this deep dive into Hamas. It's been, well, really eye-opening.
Thanks for having me. I hope everyone listening will keep learning about this complex issue. Look for different perspectives and never forget the human cost of this conflict.
And to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's been insightful for you. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe to the deep dive for more explorations of the world's most pressing issues. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep searching for understanding.